Hello, my noble band of outlaws. Outlaw Samurai coming at you live with a video. Well, if you had guessed from the title, old versus new, traditional versus tactical, medieval, or Edo period, I should say, versus modern. This is going to be a somewhat comparisonal video. Now, before you say anything, I've heard a lot of people flack about the Hanshu Boshin swords online and such, that they don't look nice, they're not aesthetically, blah 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 blah, bitching and moaning all around. But you have to think, aside from the very obvious aesthetic changes, what makes the modern day katana so blasphemous, in a sense? Now, the traditional made katana, it has the kashira, it has the ito wrap, it has the samegawa, it has the menuki, it has the fuchira, it has the sappa, the suba, the makugi pins, the habaki. But the modern sword, it has a pommel, a texture rubberized grip, bolts, and a kind of Suba crossguard hybrid. In my opinion, that's what I'd call this. But think, if you will, the differences here. I mean, and this sword has a ricasso instead of a habaki, but if you cover all this, if you cover all the hilt construction, what makes this sword any different than a normal katana, aside from the fact it's not differentially heat treated, made from tamahagane, or has a hamon, fake or real? I like that clink sound, and I don't get it with this when I sheath it gently. I have to ram it in there. But in any case, you can't look at this sword in the same light as you would this sword. And that's simply because these swords existed in two very different times. This is a modern day sword, and this is an old school sword. What I mean by that is, that's a traditionalist sword. The traditional look, feel, aesthetics of the Japanese sword is what inspired that design. This was inspired by a modern take. What would a modern version of the Japanese sword look like? And in order to fully grasp this situation, we have to go back in time. We have to create a pseudo-fantasy world here. What would swordsmen, if they still exist, if the sword still played as big of a role in our modern day world as it did a few hundred years ago, what would the modern swordsman use? And in this pseudo-fantasy world, we're imagining a world where firearms no longer existed, or if they do exist, they never got more advanced than a musket, than a percussion-capped musket. So, in a world where you have musket-based firearms, which outside the military, most civilians wouldn't be using because they would be single shot, and you'd probably have to carry about 2 or 3 pistols on you in order to safely walk down most darkened alleys in the medieval era. But this is the modern era, where we have all the same modern conveniences, modern steel, modern everything, except guns are still breech-loading muskets. Well, breech loading muskets is a muzzle loader because you have to breach the barrel, put the percussion cap in. But in any case, okay, let's say they didn't get any more advanced than a breech loading muzzle loader. Okay, so what would the modern swordsman use? Would he use this? Or would he pick up one of these? And I know what you're going to say. It all depends on the preference of the swordsman, the style he uses, the school that he was taught in. And yes, those are contributing factors, but the only factor we are looking at in this comparison video is durability. Now, let's say both these blades, this is 5160, this is 1060. Let's say both of these blades were 5160 steel. So the blades' durability are not in question here. They're made of the same steel, they're made by the same smith, they're made in the same forge. Everything about the blades are the same. They're basically sister blades. But they're put on different hilts. The traditional hilt or the modern hilt. The pros and cons of both hilts will determine mostly what you will use. We'll start with the traditional hilt. The traditional hilt has a few pros that are beneficial off the bat. First of all, it's more, in my personal opinion, it's more comfortable than the rubber. Alright? I feel personally I much rather prefer this grip style myself. But removing personal bias aside here, the traditional hilt, more often than not, offers more comfort because of the wrapping. The soft wrapping allows for the flesh of your hands to grip the sword better. And me personally, I prefer this style of grip over that one just because of the fact that it's a little more comfortable. The other pro of this grip style is that it's far more easily changed out. If it gets damaged, all you have to do is pop out the makugi pins and slap on a new grip. So it's changeability. Another one is customization. If, say, the samurai clans were never abolished and you have all these modern day samurai walking around town, samurai naturally had multiple different adornments, multiple different hilt combinations for their swords for different occasions. They'd have a display hilt, they'd have a walk around town hilt, which is very plain but still is dolled up enough to show sophistication. Like this would be a walking around town hilt. It's fancy enough that they can say, oh, he's well-off samurai, but not so fancy it's boorish or show-offy. Then you'd have a more showman hilt that you would go to fancy parties, like if you were invited to your lord, to the house of your lord, you would put on a more adorned hilt, a more adorned saya. Not something that would make your sword stand out above your lord's, but you would have a more dolled up accoutrement to your sword, a more dolled up version. And those are the three pros that are off the top of my head. If you have more, comment down below. But those are the three pros that are off my head. Better grip, more comfortable grip, ease of changeability, ease of replacement, and customization. The only major con of the traditional grip, there are two actually, and those are actually in the makugi pins and the grip itself. Now you're probably wondering what do I mean by the makugi pins and the grip itself? traditionally made katana. This is even in the cheap reproductions. Use bamboo pegs to secure the tang into the grip. Traditionally speaking, the grip was carved specifically for the blade that it was going to adorn, so that's not entirely a major issue because you'd basically have a tailored fit grip for that specific blade. But in any case, they are organic, so they can rot, they can decay, they can also break on you, and if you break a makugi pin and you don't have a replacement, you either have to break a branch off a tree and carve a new one, or order a new set of makugi pins, and you can't use the sword until you've put new makugi pins on, or you've epoxied the shit out of the grip. But that's also a bad idea because then you can't take the grip apart and clean the sword properly. But aside from that, those are the cons, the Makugi pegs. The other big con that this sword possesses is the grip itself. The grip is a big con because it's wood. It can split, it can crack, it can warp, it can trap moisture in the blade, in the tang. Well, all grips can trap moisture, but still, moisture can build up, and you can rot the tang, and the sword's tang can snap if the corrosion is deep enough. So those are the two cons of this style of grip uh, on the traditional sword. And in my opinion, which I will share later on, of why I would think an old school swordsman would choose the modern sword if he had a chance, I will explain that in a moment. But those are the cons of this grip. The pros of this grip are one, it has a pommel, so that's another con. Your hand can slide off of the old school grip. With this one, it has a pommel to stop that from happening. So there's that. Now the pros of this style of grip is that the rubberized texture handle has no means of moisture getting into it. There's no wrapping you have to worry about. Oh, another con, the wrapping can unravel on that. With this one, you don't have to worry about unraveling, the wrap unraveling. And I know what you're going to say. Well, Outlaw Samurai, some Tachi had Samegawa grips with no overwrap, with no Ito overwrap. And I do realize that. But this does not have Samegawa. This is texturized rubber plastic, or TRP. So it's completely waterproof, this grip is. So you don't have to worry about water seeping into it and getting down to the tang very easily. It can still happen, but not as easily as with the traditional grip. Your hand can't slide down the pommel easily. I mean, mine's doing that, but I'm basically just letting it do it. If I actually grip this while sliding my hand, the pommel stops it. Another thing is how it's secured. You have screws. Almost, I would make the argument, bolts. This is almost bolted together. And any kind of threaded construction will always be superior to friction fit, like the Makugi and the traditional grip. Because with friction fit, you're relying on the friction of the two pieces to keep the thing together. And with moisture and humidity, wood swells and contracts like a mother. So over time, that wood grip could loosen to the point where it's no longer viable. This rubber doesn't expand and contract without extreme heat or extreme cold. You basically have to throw rubber onto a stovetop, which exceeds over 500 degrees, in order to melt it, or at least begin the melting process. So, the modern grip seems to have more pros than it does cons. And the con that I find with the modern grip is it's not as comfortable as the old grip. Of course, this is my personal opinion. Take what I say with a grain of salt. But in my opinion, the rubberized grip kind of, I don't know, wants to pull on my skin a bit as I'm swinging it, or dig into my finger, the uh, folds of my fingers more than the other grip does. And again, this is textured rubber, so it does have all these little grooves and everything. Personally, I would feel it would be a lot better if this was all flattened out and smooth. I mean, it's already rubber, so it already gives you more than enough purchase on this thing. You don't really need to add all these, I'd say texturized bits, but that's aesthetics, I'd assume. Now, this does offer less hand protection than a traditional Suba. That is an obvious thing. I mean, the only real protection you have is to your middle finger's first knuckle joint. And even then, it's over here compared to the point. But the fact of the matter still is that this is a traditional grip. I'm not traditional grip. This is a modern grip made out of modern materials, so it's actually far more sturdy and far more heavily well fortified and built. Now, I mentioned before that why I would think a modern that if swordsmen still play that the sword still played as much of a role in our society as it did a few hundred years ago, why a swordsman would choose a grip construction and style like this over this. As I said before, this comes down to the grip's durability. This grip is far more durable than the traditional katana's grip. And if you're a swordsman, and let's say you have to fight off 5 or 6 ruffians. This is a very overly exaggerated example, but if you're, and let's say there's 2 defects. You have your choice between the 2 swords, and there's a defect in both swords. One of the Makugi pins has fallen out of the traditional grip, and I know that traditionally they were held together with one, but uh, but there were also a lot of katanas that had 2. So there, one Makugi pin fell out of the traditional grip, and one of the screws was loose on this one. Which would you choose? I still believe that the modern day swordsman in this situation would choose this because with one Makugi peg holding back an entire blade's worth of weight in front of it, if there's any other kind of structural defect in that Makugi blade, the second that sword is swung or it's smashed against something, the shock from that sword swing is going to travel down the blade into the grip to the Makugi peg. And if the Makugi peg snaps, the next thing you know, you're bringing the sword back and it's flying out of the grip like a helicopter blade of death. Whereas with this one, since it is screwed in and basically bolted together, with the fact that you have 1, 2, 3, 4 screws, you have 4 contact points to where this sword is held together. So if even one contact point fails, let's say this screw completely fouled out, as far as I'm aware, these don't connect directly to each other. But even if this was to fall out, you'd still have 3 more contact points to keep the blade in the grip and not have to worry about it flying out behind you and stabbing some innocent grandma crossing the street. So, there you go. Just for the durability of this grip alone, I would personally think that the a swordsman of our modern day would choose this sword. There's one other thing that I'll mention, but this video is already 20 minutes long, so I'll just wrap it up here. My final conclusion is that for the only thing that I've based my argument on is the durability of the grip, is why I would think that the modern day swordsman would choose a sword of this style of grip. And you don't even need to choose this specific form. Just this style of grip is enough. You can have the normal traditional suba and everything on this sword, but with the same modern grip. So until next time, Outlaw Samurai tells all y'all be crazy rednecks, be safe and use your weapons, and I'm out. Peace.